Welcome back to another Giantart Reviews. And for those who don't know, for those who are just arriving at this channel from the film review, I am Gio Penichetti, and I do a number of various podcasts, and I get around. Of course, my flagship is Content Minded, then Digital Archipelago with me and my friend Prudentialist. I co-host the Computer Room with Kathrine Dee. But also, this series is called Giantart Reviews, where I review interesting texts and films and all sorts of different things, books. But this one comes from a request, and my usual fee for films is $100, PayPal in the bio, and all my information below. And this comes from one of those requests. Of course, if you want me to review a book, that would we have to negotiate. And I've been busy lately doing a lot more artwork, and I'm gearing up to do this. I'm actually thinking about finally doing this series of, well, I would say they're paintings, but they're more drawings on the Canadian church burnings that happened throughout that one particular biopolitical event of the previous 3 years or 4 years or so. It's been a while. It's been quite a while. It's almost 4 years since the beginning of that particular Chinese delicacy, as I said back in those days, those very dark days. But anyways, this is Giantart Reviews reviewing Up in the Air. And Up in the Air, I quite like this film. I was actually curious as to why I was being requested to review this film, but I finally got it. And of course, the original novel was written by Walter Kirn, who actually, we are mutuals on Twitter, by the way. Maybe one day I will bring him on Content Minded, but I would actually have to read. I don't do much fiction reading, but I would have to. I'd have to read some of his novels. But I'm actually browsing his timeline. Apparently, he was with Matt Taibbi discussing. I am Canadian. He's discussing matters about Canada and so forth, and Trudeau's regime. But Up in the Air is his novel, and this is the film adaptation of Up in the Air that I'm reviewing, starring George Clooney, Anna Kendrick, and of course Vera Farmiga. And it's directed by, Jason Bateman was also his handler, his boss. And it was directed by Jason Reitman, and of course Jason Reitman, famous for doing those, he's a French Canadian, although he comes from a certain background, but nothing here or there. And of course his father directed the Ghostbusters films, and Kindergarten Cop, which I quite watched when I was a kid, was quite good. His father actually directed Animal House. That's incredible. But Jason Reitman, he tried to branch out into doing these socially conscious films throughout the 2000s. A lot of them became popular. I would say around the mid-2000s, he was basically at his ascendancy, especially after Juno. Juno was everywhere. And of course, me coming from a Catholic school, at the time, we watched Juno in high school. Juno was all right. It's just unfortunate. I don't know how much I could say for YouTube. I probably have to go by, Elliot Page. Just it's crazy the way that Elliot Page turned out. But Jason Reitman, of course, has a particular style of the comedy, sophisticated mid-2000s, or at least mass appeal version of sophisticated. But also the sort of comedy that's trying to be sophisticated. So Thank You for Smoking, Jennifer's Body, Young Adult. But this one in particular, I wouldn't even classify it as a comedy. I would classify Up in the Air as a great American tragedy in a lot of different ways. So for those who don't know, I like to do a very free-flowing podcasty style of film review, or any review. And I like to give at least some philosophic depth. I know that sounds so pretentious. It sounds so pretentious. But it's true. But I do like to get it out of the way, and hopefully, if someone out there just has $100 burning in their wallet, wants to give it to me to review a film, an actual film that has actual content. Although I have reviewed Legally Blonde 1 and 2, that was pretty cool. It has to have some form of sustenance, right? It can't be like a kid's film or what. Well, I mean, certain animation films are quite meaningful. I'm not going to review some like Marvel schlock. I'm not going to review outright Prawn, although I will get close to some art house films that might as well be Corn or Prawn. So, whatever, for the YouTube censorship, I use those terms. But anyways, the one thing I will say is that Up in the Air is a great illustration of postmodern man. And Walter Kirn being such a great writer, and I'm not just saying this because he's a mutual on Twitter, but he really did capture, or rather, when the novel came out, being transposed into the realities of the mid-2000s and the massive financial, geopolitical, and cultural change that was happening at the time. Walter Kirn was writing this novel in 2001, which, I would give pretty much anything to go back to 1999 to 2001. But anyways, he was writing it for a 2001 America. And, even that one particular event that happened in 2001, the novel sold quite well. But a lot of the conditions that Walter Kirn was writing about had then become very prescient and had accelerated under the conditions from which Up in the Air comes out in 2009. Now, what happens in 2008? I know a lot of Zoomers are listening to this, but a lot of people that are listeners probably know, which was the financial crisis as well. I remember I was in high school. I was in grade 12. Was I in grade 12 in 2000? No. I was in, I believe, the beginning of high school. Maybe the beginning. And in grade 12, I wrote this big paper for a university level course on global politics on the financial crisis. And actually, it's like the highest grade I ever got in high school, which I believe was like 90-something, 95, 96%. And then, of course, I went to university, and, when you're a good student in high school, the grades go way down in university. So until second year, third year. And then I graduated with honors. I have 2 masters, blah, 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 whatever. It doesn't matter. Irregardless, I could have been a PhD, man. I could have had it, man. But it's like the things changed, man. Well, things changed. I kind of didn't apply. I applied for a PhD, but things had dramatically changed by that time. And of course, when you use your real name and face and you're associated with the dissident right online, anyways. Oh, yes, Zach Galifianakis was briefly in this. The guy that did, was it Danny McBride? He did, what was that show called? That show he was in was crazy. It was kind of like, what was it called? It kind of had like Kenny versus Benny vibes. What was it called? Eastbound and Down, where he was Kenny Powers. Yeah, former professional baseball pitcher. That was like, yeah, he was in a lot of those bro comedies that were like, those bro comedies littered the 2000s. Like Pineapple Express, Superbad. I remember watching Superbad with my friends right before high school. It was incredible. But then you watch it again, it was terrible. But Tropic Thunder. A lot of those bro comedies, right? But anyways, he's in this. He's George Clooney. In the film, in the character Ryan Bingham, he's Ryan Bingham's future brother-in-law. Anyways, so it was interesting how they transposed the same themes of corporate America in the early 2000s to very much a mid-2000s context, post-financial crisis, when such a plot line and such a main theme would be incredibly more salient, even more salient than post.com bubble 2001, when Walter Kirn was actually writing the novel. And Jason Reitman does a good job. I'm not a big fan of a lot of Jason Reitman's work, but I think that he did quite a good job here. So, spoiler alert, of course. This is spoiler alert. Again, last moment of shilling. If you really want to support me, I'm currently editing my book, which is a big feat in art criticism, called Neoliberal Kitsch, Online Art and Aesthetics in the 21st Century. And if you go to patreon.com/Giantart Productions, or even substack.com/Gio's Content Corner, all the links are below. If you want to support me, you want to get full access to every episode of Content Minded in full. I save the spicier bits for the paywall because, of course, I'm afraid of getting censored. But there's a lot of different themes in this work that I wasn't expecting, because I, of course, had only vaguely heard of this film, but when I actually watched it, it really made sense. So essentially, the character, George Clooney's character of Ryan Bingham, is a human resource consultant specializing in employment termination assistance, meaning he's basically a human resources garbage disposal. He's a transient man. He is I would say, the final corporate inhabitant of the global non-place that has been created through globalization, which I will talk about later on. But essentially, he's like a corporate hatchet man. He fires people when bosses are too cowardly and despicable to fire them. And he also gives motivational speeches, and his whole philosophy of doing this is basically, he is sort of like a corporate sin eater. He has no inherent place. He's forsaken all family connections. He has forsaken all aspects and facets of identity in order to take on the sins of downsizing in corporate America. And he takes on all comers. And he flies a heroic amount across America. And I believe he said 1 year he only spent 40 miserable days at home. The rest of the days he was on the road and in the sky. And the metaphor of constant flight and air travel becomes very salient in this film. So anyways, I quite like doing this, so please support me, There's one thing I like better than art in this life, and that's podcasting. Even though I don't have a particularly good voice, or at least I don't think so. But it seems some people listen to me, whatever. And apart from that, I like the idea of writing. Although I hate the actual grammatical syntax of writing. That's always very challenging for me because I have a particular form of autism when it comes to thought patterns and trying to write over them and so forth. But, apart from doing the work of art, podcasting is, something that I get really excited for. Even I've, gone through the gamut of different podcasts, but, well, anyways. So Up in the Air really depicts the subject that lays behind a lot of the relations that happen in corporate America. Relations that very few people know the intricate workings of. And of course, if you are a corporate wagee and stuck in a cage filled with ragey every single day, then you know intimately these type of people and this type of specialty. What's so interesting about it is that, well, maybe, I don't know, because I've never worked in an office, apart from a grad lounge office, but that's, that's different. I mean, I guess academia functions effectively like a corporation, but it's different, I don't have any experience. People that still somewhat, or somehow I should say, work in offices tell me that things are kind of different now. Which is funny because nowadays the work environment, especially after Clownvid, is the sort of tail end of the transition of what Up in the Air is getting at, with teleconferencing, getting fired by HR over Zoom. All that type of stuff was predated by this film. Because, what's the character's name? Natalie Keener? Yeah. Is her name Natalie Keener. her character, she's like the up and coming wonderkin. She's, you know, she's trying to basically cut costs by creating a teleconference system and a script that a lot of different operatives can follow. And of course, they have a scene where her and Bingham, George Clooney's character, are examining one of her teleconferencing seminar training videos, where you see all of the different diverse people of the world can basically become corporate downsizers from any location. So basically predicting what we have nowadays, where an HR person or like some, you know, subcontinental can fire you over the Zoom link, which is quite crazy. So she's the future, but of course she has to learn the hard way. So she goes on the road with Bingham to see how it's actually done. And of course, she's confronted with the reality, which, by the way, was still going on at the time of filming and the time the film came out. The reality of 2008, post-2008 America, where there's rows of empty chairs and desks and sort of the stripping away of the corporate non-place. And for those who don't know, I'm referring to the Mark Ogg theory of non-places or non-spaces, or I guess nowadays the popular internet Reddit term is liminal spaces. But essentially corporations creating vast infrastructures like airports, like hotels, like offices that are designed for maximum utility, that unlike, I would even say, the offices of the past. It was funny because the other night I was on a Twitter space with my friend John D, and we were talking about corporate Memphis and the original Memphis group before corporate Memphis was associated with Humans of Flat Design. The original corporate, and I was talking about how I used to, you know, when I was a kid especially, I loved, because it was in vogue in the mid-90s, I loved the, what do they call it? The global cafe aesthetic. I love that stuff. But you could see that the office space even had a sort of unique aesthetic that was in the times that people were living in. Whereas nowadays you have this all-pervasive, open concept, WeWork, IKEA furniture minimalism that every corporation, every public space, every non-place, and you know, Mark Ogg was writing this in the 70s and 80s. And so, when it came out, I think of the 70s? Yeah. When things were still having at least some form of uniqueness or some sort of gravity that's associated with its time. But by the time you get to current day, a lot of these spaces are indistinguishable. You could go to an airport in Jakarta, you could go to an airport in Munich, you could go to an airport in Dubai, and it would still be the same thing. You still have a sort of efficiency maximalism that bleeds into the aesthetic of common experiences every day. And there's this one line in the film, and I think it comes right from the book, if I recall, that Walter Kirn wrote, about when people talk about all of the things they hate about traveling. The bright fluorescent lights, the hotel lobby sushi, the cheap soap. I forget the exact quote. He's like, people, they hate it, but I feel like I'm home. So in other words, Bingham is the man, he is the last man at the end, the last man at the end of history, I would say. Although he does occupy a very masculine, callous, borderline nihilistic and misanthropic role, which is basically to cynically sell people the dream of life after being fired. When in reality, he's basically a human corporate garbage disposal unit. Kind of like, was it Mitt Romney? I believe that was his position before he ran for president at Bain Capital. He would take these, especially during 2008, he would take like these insolvent companies and he'd basically strip them of all their assets, fire every single employee. He was designed to conquer. He was sort of like Rome going into Carthage, but in a corporate, virtual metaphor sense. But still, nevertheless, he's part of the Mormon intelligence agency network. Anyways, let's not talk about that. So Bingham is the corporate last man. He is a man of the air. You have to realize that's an incredibly important metaphor. He is a man of travel. He exists within the non-place. There's no distinguishing him between anybody else in a suit. He lives in hotel rooms. He lives out of his suitcase. He's maximized the efficiency by which he travels. And for example, there's still, in the beginning of the film, there still was that sort of new style of virtuality, which is, again, an abstraction of the human, which I'll get to near the end of the film. So Natalie Keener, and I can't get over the fact her name is Keener, because, like, you know, she's like this corporate, you know, I'm this wonder kid that graduated top of my class, and I want to make a difference in this industry that people find inhuman. And even though, I'm going to spoil it, she realizes by doing a dry run of the virtual seminar that's 10 times more alienating and dehumanizing than actually just going to someone and physically traveling to do that bloodless job of totally firing them and basically trying to sell them on what happens next by giving them their severance package and saying, oh, you can have this, you know, opportunity elsewhere. And there was this one scene where Bingham, George Clooney's character, was saying, we are in the job of selling people their future dreams. We sell them a picture of life after their position. Whereas Natalie's thinking in the new terms of this sort of corporate environment in which it's maximum efficiency, but trying to be as humanistic as possible. And it never works. It never works. Whereas the old school, which is George Clooney physically traveling and doing that solemn deed, that is what is more meaningful. Because there's this one scene where I forget his name, but I'm going to call him Vern Schillinger because that's the role that I remember him as in Oz, and he's like, honestly, that was his best role. Besides the one indie film where he's a ufologist, I think it was called Dark Skies. He was pretty good in that one. But anyways, Vern Schillinger gets fired, and then I think that's what instead of becoming a French chef. Because, okay, so what happens is she's given the first firing that she's ever done. And it happens to be the actor that plays Vern Schillinger, who has 2 small children. And he's like, what am I going to do? I make $90K a year. It's like, I have nowhere to go. I'm old. And then, of course, George Clooney's Bingham steps in and says, you know, well, you trained to be a chef, a French chef. French culinary arts when you were in college. When were you going to get enough money to leave? Like, go and do that. In other words, he's saying you can go and do your dreams. You can pursue what you want to pursue outside of the corporate wagey cagey. And then, of course, you know, Vern Schillinger, he instead becomes a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, then ends up in Emerald City in Oz, and then gets airholed by Tobias Beecher. Anyways, at least in my head canon, that's what happens. You know, Oz is such a great series. Maybe if someone wants to pay me to review a season of Oz, I would be up to that. PayPal in the bio. But anyways, so there's this moment where she starts to realize the inhumanity of what she's doing when this African American woman, she looks her dead in the eye. And for YouTube purposes, I can't say it. She says, you see that bridge? I'm going to redact myself. I'm going to sunset. And she storms out, and Natalie is like sobbing and crying and like literally shaking. And she's like, they don't actually do it, do you? And George, you know, Bingham's like, no, they never do it. They never do it. Do you ever follow up? And he's like, well, that's kind of a road you don't want to go down. In other words, like, it probably does happen. But, you know, it's like, it's best not to think about it, right? Because that's what you have to do. And so, in other words, it's all about how in current day corporate America, you have to harden yourself to all human relations, including going back to see his sister and his family, his sister's getting married to Kenny Powers, and that's not his name in the film, but he's known as Kenny Powers. And he has to like sort of play and LARP the role of human, and his armor starts to lower. But I'll get to that. So the heir becomes a very powerful metaphor for the postmodern last man, who has no family relations, no ties to a faith, no ties to any stability. His apartment there's one scene where he goes back to his apartment, and he sort of like has a thing with his neighbor, but then of course his neighbor doesn't want to wait for him, and so she's seeing someone else. And the sort of stark contrast between his home life and his actual life on the road. I mean, his apartment literally looks like a hotel room. And that's a reason why. Because really, he's home. There's this old Stain song called Home about I'm afraid to go back home, but really, like, the road is your home. Which, I mean, it's kind of crazy because every band does that where they talk about touring. I think there was one good thing that Billy Corgan said, actually, in Joe Rogan. He said that, after a while, you're on the road so much, you start to write songs and write lyrics about the experiences of being on the road. But he's like, that's ridiculous because most people in life, they can't relate to that. So why even write about it? And it's kind of a weird form of insular myopia that a lot of people that travel have. And in a way, and so he started to maximize life. And so what I was going to say is that there was a transitory periods between the new school and the old school. And he very much represents the sort of hard grindstone, going out on the road, forsaking all familiar relations, and basically existing in the air, existing as a permanent corporate transient global citizen that has no specific location, that doesn't really care for one. And so there's this, of course, the scene that everyone remembers is when they're in they're in the airport and she's fumbling with all of her baggage and it's heavy, and he goes, no, here's what you have to do. You see Asians, go behind them because they love, they're efficient, they're fast. These Arab guys get flagged. Family members have screaming children. They never hurry up. Old people are even worse. They sort of don't realize the little time that they have left. And he goes, they love, slip off and slip on shoes. And she goes, that's racist. He goes, yeah, but I'm like my mother, where profiling people is just easier in life. And it was like a little bit, still 2009. It wasn't the later half of the Obama years where terminal, like, woke scolding became the norm. Where, like, after 2012, the cultural conditions of the progressive, how shall I say it for YouTube? LGBT, by POC communism really didn't accelerate until, I would say, 2012. There was like a switch that flipped in the later period of when Obama got reelected, for some reason. But anyway, so there was still like the awareness of like, oh, that's racist. But it was 2009, right? That was the thing. And he was correct. So he's basically crafted his whole life around the machinations of what the corporate capitalist realism demands of people, which is you have to be a vector of supreme efficiency and excellence. And he's lived so long that he doesn't even remember. He doesn't even know the feeling of what home is, of what that sort of rootedness even is. But then he meets, what's her name in the film? Alex Gorin, who is Vera Farmiga's character. And she's also a traveling businesswoman. And she also realizes what that life entails. And they have an agreement together. And they meet up, they have their affair, and he's starting to sort of, quote-unquote, catch feelings. And she says, I'm basically you with that female anatomy body part. And they go on, and slowly but surely, when he has to go back to his sister's wedding, then he starts to get illusions of what it's like to have a relationship. And he's going to his town, and he's showing her his high school and what they did and all of these things, these affectations of what his life used to be. And spoiler alert, she's also a perfect global citizen. But the difference being is that when he shows up to her house, she has a family, and she's married, and she has kids, and she tells him, we had an agreement. What was the exact quote? I have it in my notes here. They had an agreement. It was all an illusion. It was a road thing, and it wasn't real. And she says, what do you expect? That's my family. That's my real life. You are an escape. You are a break from normalcy. You are a parenthesis. So incredibly cold-hearted. That was his sort of red pill moment, I guess you could say. In other words, that he was buying into a game. But then that game, that work became his shoot, as they say in wrestling. That game was no longer a game to him because he longed for someone that knew what he was going through, that he wanted a connection to. But then he realizes that, oh, I'm still this postmodern individual. I am still a nobody in the sense that I am everywhere. I am not a unique person that has a family, that has aspirations beyond a lot of the pseudo events, or these pseudo pursuits or pseudo activities that this form of living provides to the global transient citizen. So his big thing is to get the air miles. And then eventually, when he flies back from this devastating realization that this Goran woman, she has a family, she has a life, and he was just a tawdry escape, that he still exists in this space of liminality. Then he finally achieves the goal of getting, what was it, 1 million air miles? Or 10 million air miles, something like that. And he gets to meet the captain. He has this gold card. There's only like 6 people that have achieved this. And I believe the character was the same guy who narrated The Big Lebowski, if I recall. And Sam Elliott, yeah, the guy that was in The Big Lebowski. And he goes, I always imagined this moment where I meet you, and I can't remember what I wanted to say. And so it doesn't really matter at the end. But at the very end of the film, it's ambiguous. Because all of the Hilton Gold Card hotels and all of the, traveling business for many years and all of the things where he tries to basically become the perfect global citizen. In the end, he just embraces it, even though he has sort of a temporary wake-up call. That, oh, I don't have any connections. I don't have anything tying me to anybody. And so I believe the director, Jason Reitman, says, quote, in one sense, it's a movie about a man who fires people for a living. In another sense, it's a movie about a man who collects air miles excessively. In another sense, it's about a man who meets a woman who's so similar to him that even though they both believe in the idea of living solo, they begin to fall in love. And of course, she's married and she rejects him. And you could say it is kind of a surface level examination of existentialism and postmodernism, but I still think that there's enough meat in there to really examine the condition of things that were taking place. In some ways, I think maybe the film is dated because corporate life itself has changed in the post-Clownvid era. That you do have teleconferencing that is the norm. You have a different corporate structure. A lot of the old style of physically housing people in an office after 2008 was fundamentally disrupted. And I think that the work environment of, say, younger millennials and now Zoomers is quite different, at least in some respects. it's funny, like people, they always mention Office Space, how Office Space compelled corporate wages to rebel and to pursue their own interests. And it was given as a picture of total oppression and the grinding down of human potential in a sea of pseudo activities and Byzantine Kafkaesque rules that don't, and bureaucracies that don't really make sense. But a lot of people, I remember during Clownvid, when the whole remote work thing was happening, the moment was upon us. A lot of people said that when they looked at Office Space, it's like, wow, this is oppression. Like Gen Xers didn't know how good they had it. They had to invent their own bitterness and longing. Whereas the millennial and now the Zoomer, they have no choice. They have quite a different relation to the global economy that Gen Xers and Boomers had. So it's very funny how Office Space and even Up in the Air was sort of a transitory movie because it was seeing the exact moment. It was just as much in some ways a thematic documentary or mockumentary than a comedy film, because it was revealing something that was actually existing. And now that we can look back on it, how long has it been? It's been, wow, I can't believe it, 14 years. 14 years. Now that it's been 14 years, we look at things a lot differently now. And even when it comes to his relationship with Farmiga's character, there's this one line that Natalie, he's arguing with Natalie, and she's like, I have the dialogue here. He says, well, it's just casual. And he's like, your definition of real is going to evolve as you get older. Then Natalie says, the isolation, the traveling is supposed to be charming. No, it's simply a life choice. And then she says, it's a cocoon of self-banishment. He is like an ascetic of corporate life. He forsakes every human and mortal relation to perfect a goal that in the end is a pure void, a pure symbolic nothingness that mimics the air travel, that is an aesthetic representation. The spaces that he inhabits are an aesthetic representation of his soul. Mass-produced, indistinguishable, globalized non-spaces that are meant to be used by anybody that have maximum utility in mind. And so there's a form of self-banishment. He says, wow, that's a big word. Those are big words. Then she says, you have a set way of life that basically makes it impossible for you to have any kind of human connection. And now this woman comes along and somehow runs the gauntlet of your ridiculous life choices, comes out the other end smiling, just so you can call her casual. I need to grow up. You're 12 years old. And, yeah. So then but what's really funny is that scene comes up when he's trying to convince Kenny Powers of marrying his sister when he has cold feet, and the day of the wedding he runs off. He says so you ask him, like, why do you want to run off from my sister? He says, last night I was lying in bed. I couldn't fall asleep, so I started thinking about the wedding and the ceremony. I thought about how we buy a house and move in together. I thought about having a kid, then having another kid. I thought about Christmases and Thanksgivings, spring break vacation. I thought about going to football games, and all of a sudden they're graduated, have jobs, getting married, and then I'm a grandparent and I'm retired. I am losing my hair, getting fat, and then the next thing I'm dead. I couldn't stop thinking to myself, what's the point? Then Ryan Bingham goes, the point? Then Jim says, what am I starting? Ryan says, it's a marriage. It's one of the most beautiful things on earth when people aspire to do. Then Jim says, you seem happier like my unmarried friends. He says, I'm not going to lie. Marriage can be a pain in the ass. And you're right, all this stuff leads to your eventual demise. And we're all running in clocks that can't be slowed down or paused. We're all going to the same place. Then he asks, what's the point? There's no point. And Ryan Bingham goes, there is no point. That's what I'm saying. I'm not normally the guy you talk to about stuff like this. That's what's so incredibly profound about that scene is that he's being forced by familial obligation to basically go against every single thing that he believes in and he stands for, which is to be rooted, to have a family. And he can't come up with the words. So instead, when people are confronted with such things, and especially confronted with the reality of trying to emote to someone when you are disconnected from your own feelings, they turn to this sort of like cynical snark, this like, what would you compare it to? Like Jon Stewart era, Dennis Leary type of, let's get on with it. There's no meaning. Like, I guess nowadays it'd be like the Rick and Morty, there's no meaning to anything, Morty. Like, in other words, you're trying to use the cynicism as a way of masking the genuine emotion that life presents to you. But because he's been so fundamentally ripped apart by the life that he leads, he can't really say to his future brother-in-law, "Oh, it's amazing, it's a life fulfillment," even though he like BS's people every single day about a fulfilling life. What he's really doing is he himself is the perfect postmodern individual. He has no real life or connections, but he's in the job as a corporate sin eater to give people a picture of what a fulfilled life is. Isn't that crazy? It's sort of like how a chef that can't taste is a brilliant chef because he's unbiased, or how Beethoven was Beethoven deaf and blind? Or was he deaf? I forget. It's sort of like a composer that's deaf. It's like that. You are fundamentally detached from something that you have a supreme insight into. But in the end, he starts to realize that all of his seminar corporate speak, and by the way, that's another thing too, before I forget, is that this was like sort of coming out of the era of the corporate guru. Now, there are corporate gurus nowadays, but a lot of them are like crypto scammers or people that are embedded in some kind of like lifestyle grift that's involved in crypto scamming or some kind of like corporate hyena nonsense. But this was when like the 90s corporate guru, and they had all the buzzwords, and they go to seminars, they talk about synergy and like that world that Scott Adams was portraying in Dilbert the animated series, for instance. And a lot of in Office Space and the corporate motivation speak, and Anthony Robbins, and I kind of like listening to Anthony Robbins from time to time. He's kind of interesting. But that sort of corporate motivationalism was huge at the time. And a lot of those people got cleared away in 2008. But now we have a different form of the corporate guru. We have the crypto scammer, the lifestyle coach, the sort of, what was that? Like it's got like some connections to the quote unquote red pilled manosphere, like all those coal merchants, right? It's all about like getting money and having influence, and it's taking both like pickup artistry, masculinity grifting, but also like the self-help grift, and it's combining it together. And then you take crypto and accelerationism and Silicon Valley optimism, and you put them in a blender, and that's what you have nowadays. Because it's not enough to be a corporate guru. Now you have to sell people a lifestyle when you're doing your masculinity grift crypto scam. It's insane. But you see these people on Twitter, X, formerly Twitter, all the time. And it's incredible. It's really amazing. But back in the day, but notice how the corporate grifter changes with the times. Because what happened in the 90s, the New Age revival. The New Age came back in full force by the mid-90s. The early to mid-90s. And so then you had the affectation of a healer, a guru, a motivational speaker that came about when people were, quote-unquote, rediscovering their conscious potential. And of course you had Eastland and the human potential movement, and corporate America intersecting with especially Silicon Valley, and all these heads of Silicon Valley taking psilocybin and other psychedelics, and you had them listening to Terence McKenna lectures at Eastland, and of course Eastland's tied to the CIA, and it's all this big mishmash. But now that you have this like hyper online, like red pill manosphere and crypto culture that's tied somewhat vaguely to the old school Silicon Valley, Palantir, Thiel network, obsessions with transhumanism, and it's like human potential movement 2.0. But they're more unabashedly corporatist in the sense that they love the virtuality of money on a global scale, the virtuality of business on a global scale, and they sort of have retained, or at least some of them have retained, the old school corporate guruism that became popular the same time the New Age movement did, right? So it's funny how, but there was this moment in the mid-2000s, especially after 2008, where all of this stuff was gone. People were far too cynical for the corporate guru, right? Because they led people astray. So I wish people had the same cynicism towards them now. But there's this one quote he says that really sinks it. He says, and this is a narration, "To know me is to fly with me. The airport is where I temporarily live. When I run my card, the system automatically prompts the desk clerk to greet me with this exact statement, 'Pleasure to see you again.' It's this kind of systematized friendly touches that keep my world in orbit every once in a while. I do speaking engagements, motivational kind of stuff, but Gold Quest, we're talking major Tony Robbins stuff." So he's becoming like this elite speaker as well. And he tells people about the backpack and all the relations you can fit into the backpack and who would you save and what memories would you save. And it's all this stuff about trying to sell people that human connection from a man that has none of it, who's basically using the sort of what Heidegger called care, the sort of thrownness into the world, using that and bottling it as a sort of corporate snake oil salesman. And it's all in the process of this inhuman system of firing people and giving them this basically this jerk off about their future life. And it's terrible. And it almost breaks Natalie Keener in the film. But what's funny is that in the end, though, it's revealed that those people do have genuine connections, that they do have family lives. And there's this montage of different people that were fired by Bingham where they're like, well, if I didn't have my family, I wouldn't have made it. I picked up where I left off and I spent time with my kids and my wife or my husband, and I moved on. Because they have the resiliency, because having stable roots and having a purpose in life based on a purpose that is derived from the connections around you gives you a form of greater resiliency. Someone that Bingham doesn't have. I mean, he there's glimpses where he chooses to embrace it, but that illusion is crushed when he realizes that he was basically playing boyfriend and girlfriend with a slatternly woman who's cheating on her husband. And I liked Farmiga when she played, what was her name, Lorraine Warren. She was pretty good. I hated her as Olivia Soprano, as Livia, because I hated that film in general. I think Many Saints of Newark was a travesty and an abomination. And she tried to like LARP as Livia. It just didn't work. It didn't work. But anyways. Yeah, so when she's, of course, trying to sell this new corporate snake oil of thinking of acting locally but globally, using technology to basically rehaul the corporate space. And, but then it just doesn't work because they're doing something that is fundamentally should be a solemn activity, that should be reserved for the starkest of meetings, of looking someone in the eye and saying, "You're fired." You know, and I think that it was made abundantly clear to her. But then the procession of that relation, that sort of human thresher, continues. And the reason that Bingham is so threatened by Natalie Keener and her scheme is because he's at a loss for what he truly is. That newer corporate model is going to directly threaten the very thing that he holds sacred, which is his ability to be a corporate global non-person, to live in this world of liminality. And this model means that he would have to confront his life at home, or whatever he considers home. Because remember, he says to the airline pilot, the pilot asks him, where are you from? He goes, I'm from here. And he thought, well, you mean you're from, like, I forget where they were. I think they were in Omaha, Nebraska. And I could be wrong about that. But what he meant was, I'm from here, meaning that I am from the airlines. I am from the air. I am from the corporate non-place. I am from these amalgamations of offices, hotels, highways, air travel, airports, lounges, bars. I am everywhere. This is me. I travel. I live in my suitcase. You know, wherever I may roam, wherever I lay my head is home, right? So, and I think that's what was a profound statement, is that he says, like, no, this is where I am. I am truly home here. And then in the end, I think they scrapped the virtual firing program because it just, it didn't work out. And, but of course, nowadays you have memes about being fired by the HR lady over Zoom. So there's that one meme, I think, with, what's her name? The actress, not Natalie Portman. What's her name? Oh God. Anne Hathaway. There's that meme with Anne Hathaway where she's got the, like, point of view, you're about to be fired over Zoom by the corporate HR lady. And it's like that fake smile, Yeah. But on a serious note, there was the one scene where Natalie quits and tries to find another corporate job because she realized that the woman actually did, in fact, Anne Hero, sunset when she followed up with that case. And it really gave a stark reminder to her about life in corporate Americana and doing the dirty business of basically fundamentally altering the lives of people on a daily basis. And so she quits the virtual firing program, and it becomes sort of in limbo where that transition to a newer order of things is going to occur. So I think that, I think a problem with a lot of Jason Reitman films, but also films in general of this nature, or especially even documentaries. There was that one documentary that was really popular that we even watched in school. And I believe it was, may have been around Occupy Wall Street. I watched this. Actually, I was in university. I was a undergrad when Occupy happened. And then when I was in grad school, I believe that's when Gamergate happened. So anyways, there was, before Occupy even, I remember in high school, we watched that film, The Corporations. And not to say that a lot of it is, factual, but then of course the narrative, I feel, it's very interesting. And me being a critic of capitalism myself, or at least a modern manifestation of late capital, or what, I know it's not very popular to say this on the online right, but even the term neoliberal, I still think that term is at least colloquially having some value. Of course, I mean, it's the title of my book that's going to come out. I love that one interview. Not interview. Well, it's an interview, but it was that bodybuilding video by El Sambati, where he's like, you shouldn't be obsessed with bodybuilding too. You should also do something for your brains. You should read newspapers. You should read books. You should spend time with family. He truly was a god among men, El Sambati. It's very tragic how he passed way too early. But anyways, he was stolen. As much as I love and appreciate Dorian Yates, and as much as Dorian Yates has some pretty Dorian Yates is no he isn't shy from controversial opinions. Anyways, he's pretty, I love Dorian Yates, but I think that El Sambati was robbed in the Mr. Olympia. He should have won. His legs and his core especially was more well developed than Dorian Yates. But I think at the time in the mid '90s they were trying to move away from size monsters. Anyways, I'm getting distracted. So yeah, you should do something for your brains. My book is the title of it is Neoliberal Kitsch. So anyways, it's something that I don't shy away from, but I do realize that there's a critique of that concept. But what I was really going to say is that, and I know it takes me a long time to get to certain points, is that when it comes to a critique of capitalism, you're given a few options. Either you're totally stuck in the samsara cycle of LARPing Marxism, which may or may not be intellectually or conceptually fruitful, or you are given sort of like a Thomas Piketty, or I would say Chrystia Freeland when she wrote that book Plutocrats. You're given sort of like a mushy lib version of criticizing the excesses of capitalism that in itself is a form of institutional critique that isn't really designed to go anywhere. And I think that's the problem with a lot of popular media, especially, and films, when they go down the road of a sort of like I wouldn't say, well, maybe lazy, but I would say a sort of half-hearted critique of the corporatization of life and late capitalism and neoliberalism. But what is put in place is not exactly thought out in a fully fleshed manner, because it would require a lot of nuance, and because it's more of an artistic and existential exploration of the condition of humanity, the condition of the average global citizen under the machinations of late capital and neoliberalism and the corporatization of life. There's not going to be a lot of easy answers provided for you. But I do think that it's a very genuine exploration nevertheless. And I think that, unfortunately, Jason Reitman's work does suffer from a sort of empty social critique that doesn't lend itself particularly to any it's like Christopher Nolan, it's like any of these pop directors that are at the height of the mainstream Hollywood that try to insert some form of questioning of things. It leads to a form of, I would say, conceptual impotence, because the questioning is just for its own sake. It's not for anything constructive. You could even say Juno was kind of like that. And of course, immediately, Elliot, quote unquote, Page, denounced, it was evil, I shouldn't have done it. Like, it's just whatever, right? It was pro-life propaganda. But it kind of was, but at the same time, it left a lot of those questions open-ended. Because it's very hard to conceptualize your way out of certain problems that this film or any other film that critiques late capitalism presents. In a sense, this sort of doomerism of people like Mark Fisher was, Mark Fisher, to be fair, wasn't exactly a pure doomer. I mean, he did have his more, I would say, positive conceptualizations of things, like, acid communism, even in a lot of his writings in K-punk. But I would say that when it comes to his magnum opus, Capitalist Realism, people debate whether it was his magnum opus or not, but for popularity's sake, it is. Then a lot of his critiques are apt. You can even find yourself being sold an internalized critique of the system by the system itself. This is like why Banksy is such an incredibly crass and impotent and vulgar non-artist, because he just presents you a baseless form of questioning that in the end of the day is already basically prescribed by the regime. So, make of that what you will. And it's not to say that everything the film presents is, a lot of it is necessary. It's not that it's wrong to do this, but rather we just have to examine that there is a limitation in a Hollywood film for, and I shouldn't like automatically degrade something because it's a big, mainstream budget Hollywood film, but I would say there is a limitation in how much current day Hollywood. I mean, I know it's been quite a while since this film came out, but there's limitation in terms of how modern Hollywood can approach things with any nuance. When it's sort of like pop lib, champagne socialist type of things, and they don't really actually critique, especially in modern times. By modern times, I mean the last 10 years. They've sort of burned through their actual critique of capitalism or late capitalism or whatever, and now it's all just a bunch of by POC, a bunch of LGBT by POC communism, right? So it's not really, and one that isn't really critical of any economic structure, but rather just a form of social critique over and over and over again from the left liberal global progressive viewpoint. And it really just is a testament to the real heart of the political left. There was that one brilliant tweet by an anime account, I forget his exact at, that said like, the real heart of the left is things that you can't criticize, like race idolatry, like to the extent that they were, worshipping of the other, certainly the politics of actuality. Those are the real things. You could be like on the left, quote unquote, but still be like a bloodthirsty, ruthless capitalist, but you can't really criticize these other things. So that's like basically what Hollywood has gone towards. And there was brief moments in modern Hollywood in which they were approaching a more productive form of social critique, or one that critiqued the prevailing economic structures that, always did kind of devolve into why rich people have a lot, why poor people have little. But nevertheless, still having a sort of critique of the heart of power. For example, in the 90s, there was always this criticism of, right before the ascendancy of the internet age, the criticism of like films like The Matrix and Existence, and even films before and after, where it was like the culture industry center of the system itself was critiquing itself in such a way as to question everything, that there is a fundamental layer of simulation and unreality that pervades all of the real. But then as time goes on, now it becomes like listen and believe messaging. It becomes we are dictating values to you, and there's no room for questioning. And then and so of course after 2008, and especially during Occupy Wall Street, there was sort of a look at the corporate America and capitalism and so forth. But now that's gone. That's gone. It's all just the shibboleths of left liberal progressivism worldwide. But anyways, that's a long divergence. Let me close out this by reading a few passages from Mark Ogg himself, who wrote the book Non-Places. And this is from an interview, and I think it really is an apt description when we examine this particular work. And of course, I'm a huge fan of Mark Ogg. I actually liked this before the Redditors discovered liminal spaces. And like, why do they make us feel like we're alienated? And why do they make us feel like creepy, but also nostalgic? It's like, okay, yeah, okay. But that's, listen, I'm not going to lie. I do like those aesthetic images, liminal space compilations. But I think that the soillennial left-coded video essayists have taken something without actually having any philosophic training, and they just run with it, and it's terrible. So anyways, this is Mark Ogg interviewed by the IPU Pakore, the Broken Vessel. I believe it was from it's an excerpt. It's the blog, but it's an excerpt from an interview he did with Verso Books in 1995. And the book I think the reprint came out in 92. So Ogg, and of course there's a lot of painters, there's a lot of visual artists who have dabbled in this theme, not just Edward Hopper, but also John Register would be another name. Number one, for me, place has never been an empirical notion. Anything can become a place. Every space can be one. If in one manner or another encounters take place that creates social ties. A space can be either it's worded awkwardly. A space can be either a place or a non-place, or a place for some and not for others. One classic case is the airport. The airport, which is a very different case for some who work there regularly with colleagues and relationships, and someone who passes through only once, or by chance. But of course, Bingham is kind of like an employee. He lives through the airport. He's kind of like that crazy Iranian guy that lived in an airport for 30 years. Was it 20 years or 30 years? I forget. But he basically lives in this transient existence permanently, to the point where all the hotels look the same, all the airports look the same, and he does feel like home in an odd way. And this leads to the second point, the second bullet point here. The second point is that sometimes nostalgic visions that we have of the past, we tend to consider the new as something that twists the nature of what existed before, past versus present. And so place is good, or so having a place is good, because we meet people and we establish relationships there. While the non-place is bad because then everyone is a stranger to everyone else. These new non-places are socially estranging. That was not and is not my intention, to apprehend valuation of these different spaces, yet it's not the positive valuation of space apparent in the exact form of non-spaces below. So I believe that's the interview asking him. It is necessary to attempt to characterize whatever is new in the contemporary world, and in my opinion, what is new is a change of setting. A shift in references which implies that space is no longer perceived in the same way. Non-places could be seen approaching them from another vantage point as the heirs to everything that has created discomfort or annoyance in the history of human species, i.e. these non-places are estranging per se. However, when reflecting upon the meaning of travel, we should consider that this negative definition of the non-place rules out the possibility of adventure. Encounters often take place in a space that is not yet symbolized, which can prescribe social relations. In a non-place, the notion of the unknown, the mysterious appears. Knight errants, the Knights of the Round Table, and the stories handed down to us from the Middle Ages set off in search of adventure. That is, once upon a time, non-place was a positive / cataphatic, i.e. known through affirmation. It represented adventure and mystery. Now it is a negative apathetic, i.e. known through denial. It represents rootlessness and estrangement. Perhaps the non-places Og discusses are positive too. See Adam Greenfield on the Making Non-Place into Place, and he says, quote, this is Adam Greenfield, you know where this definition begins to break down, though. When you spend way too much time in non-places. All of a sudden, in a process that somewhat resembles a figure / ground reversal, these punitively anonymous and intense interstitial zones take on texture and resolution of their own. Then one can no longer see them as non-places, as entirely flat and featureless. I've learned that everything has texture if you see it often enough. And this is very true. I mean, there's a lot of relational aesthetics people that try to do these public space art exhibitions where people can gather and sit down, and people often try to sort of retexture or reappropriate non-places and give them a sort of uniqueness. I don't know whether these art experiments are totally, how shall I say it? If they're totally effective, but nevertheless, it's a very interesting thought experiment. And then another quote, this place / non-place stuff is old hat. Heidegger and Foucault has been spawned in a new kitsch industry of aesthetic pandering for non-places like airports and often transport terminals, supermarkets, multinational corporate retail outlets. As Dylan Trick suggests at Side Effects, this is not to say that we haven't pandered for places through the many avatars of blunt, unburdened ideology. Husserl suggested in discussion of kitsch, Heimat worship, of the Heideggerian Edward Casey on place as the bedrock of our being in the world, getting back into place. Quote, place, at least in the view of the anthropologist, is a space long taken over by human beings. And when something is said about relationships which human beings have with their own history, their natural environment, and with one another. And then this is a quote from Og from his other essay called Architecturally Speaking, Practice of Art, Architecture, and Everyday Life. Just as imagination takes us forward into the realm of the purely possible, into what might be, so memory brings us back into the domain of the actual and the already elapsed, to what has been. Place ushers us into what it already is, namely the environmenting subsoil of our embodiment, the bedrock of our being in the world. If imagination projects us beyond ourselves, while memory takes us back beyond ourselves, place subsets and enfolds us, lying perpetually under and around us. In imagining and remembering, we go into the ethereal and the thick respectively. By being in place, we find ourselves in what is subsistent and enveloping. But, which is, I would concede the argument that that's true. That even a non-place can bring about a form of significance. And there is moments in which Bingham in the film, for example, when he's taking his those wedding photos for his sister around America. But people they're taking photos of different locations with this cardboard cutout of them. He's explaining the significance of that one airport from which Hughes that did the transatlantic flight, and he's explaining the significance of it, even though Natalie Keener doesn't really get it. But he's so thoroughly ensconced with the non-place of the airport, with being a frequent flyer, with being acquainted with the air, that he starts to even ground his very being in the world within something that by definition is a mass service non-place that shouldn't have a mark of signification. But because he's studying the history of these spaces, and because he's thoroughly embedded within them on a daily basis, to him it's just as much his history as if you were going down to a local significant location in your town or your city, and you would find a meaningful relation to it. Because the location is something that does envelop you, that creates the co-communal form of embodiness that you relate to your own self towards others. Because it is literally the space in which you relate to others. But at the same time, also what the film is really good at is that it breaks down this sort of internationalized postmodern man as a vector of information. He is in a global information exchange system to where he's going to the front desk of a hotel from the airport, and they greet him in a different way because they know that he's of a different informational class. So he is a form of information nomad. His information is in the cloud. It is in the global information hub that can be accessed at any time by a number of functionaries who service these non-places, such as hotels and airports. And therefore they act accordingly. So in a way, he's morphing on a global scale a form of familial relationships that he's morphologically grafting himself on. Because when you go to one area of the globe, they have your same information as if you go to another area of the globe that you're traveling to. And in a way, it brings us closer into a sort of subversion existentially of those non-places. Because he really does feel at home. He really is greeted the same. He may see the same people working the same desk at the same time in a different car rental place or a different hotel lobby. And it's all the same. Even though they are designed to be non-places that have no distinction or no, no fundamental relationship of thisness that Heidegger would say. They are not that. They are not of a location. They don't have a root into a community or a unique historical moment or a unique place that means something to a group of people. They are, by definition, a product of the utilitarian maxing of modern-day capitalism and globalization. So overall, I think it was a great film. It could have been improved in certain areas, like the pacing or whatever. But it certainly was one of the more meaningful Jason Reitman films. And so, like I say, if you want to pay me to do another movie review, or even a book review might be a bit more, we'd have to DM about that. Yeah, I have a bunch of other stuff I have to do. So yeah, this has been great. All my information is below. And this has been another installment of Giantart Reviews. So as I always say, God bless, goodbye, too sweet.